Welcome to Staying Connected, a podcast where I talk to people about their stories with VEDS, Marfan, Loeys-Dietz, and related vascular and aortic connective tissue conditions. This is your host, Katie, and before we get into the show, I want to remind you that the views, information, and opinions in this podcast are those of the individuals involved, and the information presented does not constitute medical or other professional advice or services. Any opinions that I express in this podcast are my own and not of my employer. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Staying Connected. I have Vascular Ehlers-Danlos Syndrome, or VEDS, and on this show, I talk to other people about their stories with VEDS and similar conditions like Marfan syndrome and Loeys-Dietz. Today, we're going to talk to Mikala Tingley, whose brother David had VEDS. David passed away at the age of 24 and was diagnosed with VEDS after his death. Mikala is joining to share his story with VEDS. Please be advised, this episode does contain some graphic detail about David's death, which may be disturbing to some listeners. Please practice self-care when listening to this episode and reach out to your support network if you need to. Before we go over to the interview with Mikala, did you know that Staying Connected now reaches people on all 7 continents in 84 different countries? This show continues to spread around the world, and if you want to support it and help it continue to reach people who need to be connected to this community, join my Patreon. For $5 or $10 a month, you can support the production of this show and content about VEDS, Marfan, and Loeys-Dietz. I've linked the Patreon in the episode show notes, and I just want to say thank you to everyone who has been supporting the show already. I couldn't do it without your continued support, so thank you. As always, my top-tier patrons are listed in the episode show notes. This show will release every other Saturday through September, so make sure you subscribe on your podcast player so you don't miss any episodes. And stick around at the end of the show for a preview of the next episode. Hey Mikala, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast to share your brother David's story with VEDS. Do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself to everybody, where you're from, a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Mikala Tingley. I'm from Kettering, Ohio, which is just a little bit south of Dayton. I am 41 years old and a mother of 3, married to my husband, and I am a special needs teacher here in Kettering, Ohio, special needs aide at an elementary school here locally. My brother and I grew up here in Kettering, Ohio. Neither one of us really left. And I'm so excited to share his story and his journey with VEDS to just spread awareness and those warning signs to hopefully stick in people's minds and just to keep his story going.
Yeah. And so we know David's no longer with us today. So do you want to share something special about him before we start talking about his story with VEDS?
Yeah, sure. So David got to be with us for 24 years. Initially for us, that was obviously a very sad thing. 24 is a very short life, but we try to focus on the 24 years that we got to have with him. He lived a very normal life. He lived life very carelessly and freely. He was kind of a free spirit through his whole life. And I think that was a special thing about him. He never let anything hold him back, even though as I share his story, you'll learn that we didn't know anything about VEDS while he was here living with us. And he could have very well let a lot of his, we'll call them disabilities and disadvantages against him hold him back. And he never did. And I just think that that's something so special and that we should all be able to live that way, carefree and carelessly sometimes. It doesn't, as long as you're safe, I think it's okay to be careless sometimes.
For sure. So when he passed away, you did not know that he had VEDS. So let's start with his childhood. Like, what was that like? What were some signs that he had VEDS that we didn't know about?
Sure. So at the time, obviously, we didn't know any of these things that I will tell you were signs of VEDS because We'd never heard of that. We had never heard even anything of like a connective tissue disorder, nothing even of a genetic disorder at that. So as a boy, as a child, he lived very normal. He was a rambunctious, wild little boy. He was always into something. He was into hunting and riding dirt bikes and, bicycles and motorbikes and all the things that he could get into. However, we would always say he was very accident prone. That being in the fact that if he was to fall off of a bike, it wasn't a typical little scrape that another kid would have on their knee, little scrape, maybe get a Band-Aid. He was probably going to the hospital to get stitches. He was always in the hospital getting stitches. The kid, I can remember we went to daycare when we were younger. And I remember this particular daycare, I think they called, it's not funny, but I want to say they had called the squad out for him probably at least 3 times within the years that we were there, going there, attending that daycare. Just for one time, he busted his head open on the sandbox. One time, I remember this very vividly because I was involved. I was flipping over these little bars and he would follow me around and I kicked him on accident. I was flipping and I got him right on the eyebrow and it cut him right open just from that little, another kid may have gotten a black eye, but it gashed him wide open, split him. Yes. And so that, that stands out to me, knowing what I know now of signs and, things to look out for. But then we just thought he was accident prone. That's what we used to say. That just sticks out in my mind of a term that we would use when we would describe him. Now, that being said, my mom and my parents were constantly questioned by children's services, always looked into, because not only when we would take him to the hospital to get whatever wound he had taken care of, he would also be covered in bruises. He just always had bruises up and down his legs. From riding a bicycle, the pedals would get him on the shins and he would just always be beat up looking. And so they were constantly being questioned and looked into, investigated, all of that. It's very sad, to think of parents to go through that, because you're struggling at the same time. Like, why is my kid?
Yeah.
Why every time he falls or he gets hurt, do we need to take a trip to the ER? One in particular thing that sticks out with me of his childhood that I'll share with you that is kind of an incredible thing that he went through. He was in the 4th grade. So I want to say maybe about 10 years old. He was attacked by a dog and it was at the park. And the dog got him on the side of his jaw and his face and close to there were a few spots right here close to his neck. But looking back now and thinking about what those traumatic things can do to someone with VEDS, how he even managed to he had over, I can't remember an exact number. I know well over 200 stitches. I want to say close to somewhere in between 300 to 400 stitches in and outside of his face, several reconstructive plastic surgeries on his face. And those scars never did heal very properly. They were real thick and very prominent on his face, just like any scar that he had. Pictures, I was going through some pictures to send to you of him when he was little, and right here on his forehead where he busted it open on the sandbox at the daycare, he always had this huge circle scar. And even into his adult life, it was still so prominent right there on his forehead. So, as a child, a little boy, you could say he lived a typical life, because he did pretty much, but with the side effects of constantly having wounds and stitches and something going on. I just forgot, backing up a little bit, when he was, I want to say he was about 2.5 to 3 years old, his eardrum ruptured out of nowhere. No trauma, no anything sudden, blunt, anything that you would think would cause a rupture of an eardrum, no constant ear infections, and it ruptured just out of nowhere. I can remember the blood just like pouring out of his ear. And so that was one big thing, but I was a kid then, so I don't ever know what the doctors kind of attributed that to or whatnot.
Yeah, I really think that's like, I think that's an area of research still to be done too. Because I know, like myself as a kid, like I ruptured my eardrums at least 8 or 9 times with ear infections. And then as an adult, like every time I get an ear infection, my eardrums rupture within like 24
Are you
hours.
serious?
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
It's incredibly painful. And I don't think that I don't think that's documented anywhere as like a known sign of VEDS, but I would suspect that is related when I hear it with other kids in the community too. So it's amazing though that didn't happen with an ear infection with him.
I can't say 100% obviously, because I was a kid also, but I don't remember him being like, I don't remember him being sick or having, something going on that we would think, oh my gosh, like that's why that happened, know? So kind of weird.
So did he go through, like with the bruising, did he end up seeing a hematologist or anything like that for bruising?
Yeah. So he went through his childhood, teenage years, pretty typical. Once he hit high school, he started wrestling on the wrestling team. And so sports was never really his thing. My mom tried. I remember her putting him in like t-ball and baseball and those kind of things. And he just never stuck on for him. And so he started to wrestle his freshman year. Or no, actually, I think he started his sophomore year, regardless, his teenage years. So once he started wrestling, he would come home from wrestling practice and the poor child would look like, he would look like he got jumped. That's what he would look like. He would be black eyes and bruises up and down his arms and legs. And even like his eyebrows would split, like he would get cuts, on his eyebrows. That was pretty typical for him. Or like his nose would bleed a lot. He would always get nosebleeds. And so the athletic trainer for our local high school here in Kettering recommended to my mom that he be seen by a hematologist, because obviously to her that was not normal. So she did, had him seen by the hematologist. And also another thing that would happen with him that I heard on one of your other podcasts from another family is he would get fluid on his knee, like huge sacks of fluid, and he would have to have those drained. Now, I don't know that like it pertains to anything, but it just, it was something that I heard about a knee issue on one of your other ones. And I was like, that is so weird. I remember him he would just go get it drained like it was no big deal. And his shoulder would dislocate also, but that too, he would pop it back in on his own and go about his day. Yeah. So mom had him seen by the hematologist. The hematologist, I'm not honestly sure exactly what, testing was done on him or whatnot they looked into, but I do know that they referred him to an oncologist. The oncologist did some testing and everything always came back normal. Like nothing ever showed any kind of like blood disorders or cancers or anything, terminal illnesses that they looked into. Nothing ever came back. And so they never really did anything for him. He continued to wrestle through high school. And that was that, really. He never really had any more major issues until his adult life.
Mm-hmm. And what happened then?
So 2008, 2009, his colon ruptured. Out of nowhere, he just started feeling sick one evening. He started feeling very sick and he's faint like he was going to faint. And I remember mom rushing him to the hospital, and he was septic. His colon had ruptured and his bowels were leaking. And so they immediately put a colostomy bag in for him. He had that colostomy bag, I want to say, for about 5 to 6 months before they tried to reverse it. So before you go in to reverse the colostomy bag, there are some procedures you have to do. You have to drink some things and you have to follow some rules. And so David still lived at home at the time. And my mom was very protective and very conscious about what he was doing. So she made sure he followed, every single rule, every direction, every preparation, exactly what he was supposed to do. So they went in to reverse the colostomy bag and he almost bled out on the table. Then they had to stop the surgery. They were not able to reverse the colostomy bag that day. They came back to my mom. So just to back up a little bit, when his colon did rupture, of course, there were questions. We're like, how does that just happen? How does a colon just rupture? He hadn't had any kind of trauma. Again, no blunt force, no any kind of anything that would warrant that. And so they, asked a lot of questions about his daily activities. And he did at the time ride BMX bikes. And so they attributed that to a potential accident on a BMX bike. They thought maybe he had taken a handlebar to the stomach and just didn't remember, or something had happened that he didn't remember. So back to reversing the colostomy bag, they come back out to mom and they say, they tell her what has happened and pretty much accused him of taking aspirin before the procedure. And my mom's like, I don't even have aspirin in my house. We followed every direction. He doesn't take aspirin. That's not something he would go and take anyway, but they still kind of argued with her. I remember it being kind of a back and forth thing between them. And so they were not able to reverse it that day. They waited, I want to say it was about 6 weeks they had to wait, and they were able to finally go in and reverse the colostomy bag. He was able to not have it anymore. However, that scar was unlike anything I had ever seen before in my life. It was so long and just so thick and wide, and it didn't want to heal. It kept getting infected, and it was just a nightmare of a recovery for him. I remember that just being an awful, awful, awful process that he went through. So once he was finally healed, I want to say it took a good year for him to finally be like completely healed, like to where that was closed. There were no open spots on it. It took a long time. And so he went through a couple good years, really.
And how old was he then? Like he's like 20 or?
He was about 21, I would say, when he was completely healed and good to go, so to speak. So like I said, he kind of went, a couple years, like the typical dislocation, his shoulder would pop out, things like that, but nothing traumatic, like what he went through. And then in 2010, so I want to say he went maybe about a year and a half with absolutely no complications. 2010 of October, so late 2010. It was actually around Halloween. He had his spleen rupture.
And it was his actual spleen, like not the splenic artery.
Yes, it was his actual spleen that ruptured. And they thought that some scar tissue from his colon issues had attached to his spleen. And he, at the time, was working at a restaurant, and he did do some like heavy lifting and, lifting, reaching, kind of things like that. And so it pretty much convinced all of us that some scar tissue had attached to his spleen. And when he reached or he lifted, that had ripped from his spleen and caused it to rupture. And he was in the hospital. That was late. I went right around Halloween, and he did not come home until, I can't even remember if he was home for Thanksgiving. I don't think he was. If he was, he had just gotten home from the hospital and did not get to enjoy Thanksgiving like he should have. The last pictures that I have from him are from that Christmas, and you can kind of see that he was swelling. He was a real tiny guy his whole life, very small, maybe 125 pounds, 5'4", like just a teeny guy. And you can see in those pictures his face and his body, even like his upper body was just holding water. You can tell that he just looks bloated.
Yeah. What did they do to fix the spleen? Did they take it out, or was he able to keep part of it?
Nope, he was able to keep it. I do remember him being on IVs. I don't know. I'm so sorry. I don't know. Like,
I was just curious
how they treated it, but they did not remove his spleen. I do know that he was able to, and I will tell you, maybe I do remember they did not want to do surgery on him if they could avoid it because of his history of bleeding. And one other thing I remember that popped out to me was he loved tattoos. He had a lot of tattoos. And when he would get a tattoo, he would bleed so bad. And like the tattoo artist would always be like, what in the heck is going on? Because they would have like loads of paper towels from wipe, just he would bleed so heavy. That was just another thing that had popped out to me about him. But so his spleen, he was able to keep it. He came home. He never did go back to full duty at work. They had him on light duty, and he remained on that. January 11th of 2011, he came home from work. He worked that night. He lived with my mom and dad still. Came home that night. He got home probably, I would say it was probably close to 11. He worked late. It was at a restaurant, so he was probably the closing shift in the kitchen, and it was probably a later evening. Came home, straight home to my parents, and they describe him very agitated, irritated. Like, he came home and he was like, my shoulder hurts. He was agitated by it though, and he was complaining in his shoulder blade area, which was kind of typical, like, with his dislocations, he would be sore after that. So they were asking him, like, did it dislocate or anything happen? And he's like, no. And so my dad's like, well, why don't you just go down in the basement, which that's where he lived in the basement, and like stretch, like just try to relax, like calm down and just chill. And so he did. He went down and he I don't know what, stretched, relaxed for a little while, a couple hours actually. And then came back up around, I want to say it was around 2 a.m. Came back up kind of in a fit of rage and was like, something's wrong. My chest hurts really bad. He told my mom he thought he was dying. He said that to her. So she called 911. He was able to walk out to the ambulance, got him to the hospital, which was minutes away from my parents' house. They got him in there. They did a CAT scan or a MRI, some kind of scan. I'm not sure. I was not there yet, so I don't exactly know, but some kind of scan to see what was going on, because he was in so much pain is what was prompting them to do the scan. And so they came back after the scan and said that he had some fluid around his heart and that they were probably going to release him that evening or night, and that they would have him follow up with a cardiothoracic surgeon to have a biopsy done. I remember those words specifically. And so at that time, my parents didn't really think that there was any reason, to panic. They had called me to let me know that, he was in the hospital and that, that he was going to be there for a few days, or that that's what they thought at the time. And so they had come back, said they were possibly going to release him. And then they came back again and said that actually one of his test results came back and his sodium levels were critically low, and that they were going to need to admit him to do some further testing because they did not know why his sodium level was so low. So at that point, they kind of encouraged my parents to go home, take a shower. They were going to admit him into a room. And at that time, they had given him some morphine, because he was in a lot of pain. So they were trying to, give him some relief, administered some morphine, and it actually had an adverse reaction. It made him very sick, which was a very typical thing for him. He could not handle pain medications very well. And that was typical, like his whole life. He just could not handle them very well. He would always make him sick and not feel good. So my mom actually, was like, can we just not give him the morphine? Like, let's just let him try to rest. And so they agreed. And my parents left. They went home to shower. I don't know exactly what time they left him. I want to say it was probably in between 3 and 3:30. They got home to shower. My mom had just enough time, I think, to take a shower before they were calling her back to tell her that they had administered another shot of morphine because he was in so much pain, and that it had sent him into a seizure, and that at that point, they tried to administer a central line, and they had hit a main artery, and that my parents needed to get back to the hospital as soon as possible because they were having trouble stopping the bleeding, is what the phone call sounded like. And so at that point, my parents called me. We all kind of met each other at the hospital, and it was about 5:00 in the morning when we all got back there. And for, I want to say, like the next hour and a half was just like a blur. It was just doctors like coming in and out saying they were taking him back to get scanned again because they couldn't figure out why they couldn't stop the bleeding. They didn't know where the bleeding was coming from. They were panicking just as much as like we were. I can remember feeling the panic in them. Like it was just an unsettling feeling that they had no idea what was happening. And so finally, a doctor came in and basically told us that what they thought was that when they administered the central line, they hit a main artery and just could not stop the bleeding, and that he bled out. And that's basically the explanation that we had that day. He was 24 at the time. They took us back, like, to say our goodbyes. And I mean, he was gone. Like it was nothing. They tried, I do believe that they tried everything that they could. And I do believe that they were almost just as traumatized as we were. I remember there was a nurse sitting in the corner just crying. It was awful. It was awful. I mean, he was still in the ER, like in the triage area. He had never even made it to a room. It was traumatizing. And so we left the hospital that day truly believing and thinking that the hospital made a mistake and that they killed my brother. That's what we left the hospital thinking. So, of course, an autopsy was performed. 12 weeks later, the autopsy took to perform. The coroner personally called my mom after the autopsy was finished and let her know that he passed away. His cause of death listed on his death certificate would be a triple aortic dissection. However, it was caused or due to complications from a connective tissue disorder. And so he tells her that he asked if David had any children, which he did not. He asked if he had any siblings, and I am the only sibling. So he said that any siblings and any children of those siblings needed to be tested immediately. And so she asks, well, where do they go to get this testing? How do we get this done? And he says, well, she needs to find a geneticist, and that's who will be able to help her.
For just a broad connective tissue disorder.
That's all we knew at that moment in time, was that he died from a triple aortic dissection due to complications of a connective tissue disorder, is exactly what I said when I went to this poor geneticist in Dayton, Ohio. I will give him a little plug. Dr. Marvin Miller. He has since retired, unfortunately, but he truly was an angel for my family. I made an appointment as soon as I could get in, which I'm sure you know, with the geneticist is not as quick as you want it to be. But I waited my turn. I got in, and I show up with my son and my daughter. And I'm like, here we are. Test us. We need to be tested. And he's like, okay, first I need to look at the autopsy, which he did. And it's so funny because talking to him he read the autopsy, and I think that appointment lasted that day. I wouldn't say it was a long time. It was going on 2 hours of an appointment, just of him asking history and information about David. He knew that day. He knew what he wanted to test me for. However, when my brother passed away, he didn't have health insurance. And so when you have an autopsy without health insurance, they kind of do the bare minimum of testing here in Ohio. Anyway, that's how it is. They will test you for, every illegal drug in your system. They will test you for, I guess, up to the connective tissue disorder. But Dr. Marvin Miller says to me, honey, there are hundreds, thousands of connective tissue disorders. I have no idea what to test you for. And he's like, without knowing, I can't go to your insurance and say, hey, let's test this young woman for every connective tissue disorder that there is out there. Let's run a full panel. He's
this is back in 2011, right? So it's still
this
expensive.
Is 2011. Very expensive testing. And so he's like, let me do a little work here. Let me do a little, and just bear with me a little bit and trust me. And so I'm like, I really didn't trust him at the time, but I really didn't have any other choice either. So he contacted the coroner first to make sure that he still had vials of my brother's blood that he could even test, that if this was even a possibility. I do believe that there was kind of some arguments back and forth between himself and the coroner about the testing, but he could not get the coroner to agree to test my brother and use, I guess, I don't know what money he was wanting him to use, but to fund it, basically, to test David's blood. So the next step, he comes back to me and he says, now the next step is up to us. He said, we have to write letters to I believe it was the governor of Ohio at the time. Myself, we all wrote letters on behalf of my brother's story and on behalf of myself, not knowing what to be tested for. And a coroner calling my mom, telling her that this is a very life-threatening disorder and that we need to be tested, but we have no idea what to be tested for. It took about 6 months of persistence on Dr. Marvin Miller, but after that time, he got a fund in the state of Ohio for testing for immediate family members, genetic. I do know that it is for immediate genetic family members, like siblings, offspring, possibly parents, to be tested. There is a fund for genetic testing to test the deceased so that the living family members can go and properly approach the medical personnel that they need to be in touch with and get the proper testing that they need to be tested for, and not have to go through the hoops and really praying that they had some of my brother's blood left, because that doesn't always happen. It could have been disposed of.
Yeah, real kudos to you and Dr. Miller for like that is some amazing
Amazing.
persistence and amazing work to get that set up, not only for you, but for other families in the future who go through this in Ohio.
Absolutely. And I will tell you at the time, Dr. Marvin Miller had only had one case of VEDS in his Dayton clinic. Okay, I could be lying. I could be lying. He could have had living cases. He had one case of a deceased person that he had personally worked with. So that just shows how rare and, it's so easy to I don't know the right term, but blame, I guess, like medical professionals. But I mean, if you really think about it like that, I mean, he is retired now. So he's probably had been practicing for many, many, many years and had one case of a deceased person
I'm
with
just so,
VEDS. I mean,
yeah, I feel so kind of just wowed by him just for the sheer, like, I mean, it would have been so easy for him to just be like, well, it was denied, like find a way to pay for your testing for the whole gambit of connective tissue disorders. For him to go through that 6 months of writing letters to the governor or whoever it was that managed to set up this fund, like how above and beyond that
that's
feels.
I mean, that's why he literally is an angel. And then, after working with us, and I always used to tease him because I was not nice to him that first appointment. I was like, I did not want to take the fact that he needed a little time to figure out, what exactly to test me for. I didn't want to take that for an answer. I wanted an answer right then. And when you're those emotions, I just lost my only brother, my absolute best friend in my whole life. Like, I was not a very nice person to him that day. And so for him to take our family under his wing like that, and then, for years so David passed away in 2011, and we are now in 2023. So I want to say about up until about 2018 or 19, it was a couple years before COVID had happened that he retired. He was also a professor at a local university here, a Wright State University, and it's highly known for medical school. And he would let my mom and I, or invite us to come and just share my brother's story at one of his lectures every single year for years upon years, and to see the interest in those students, like every time my mom and I would go speak, there was not one person in that lecture room that was not engaged with us. They were all listening, asking questions. There was nobody on their phones or, doodling. Like, every single year, they were so in tune with us. And that was just such an incredible feeling to know that these are people that are going to go out into the medical profession, and hopefully, David's story is going to stick with them, even if it's just one little thing, that might be in common with somebody that they see.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really powerful and wonderful that he did that. And I truly believe in like the times that I've been able to talk to medical students has just been so, it's just touching for that same reason that you mentioned.
Yeah,
It's like every time
it's
I've done
very
it,
powerful.
the students are so interested and caring, and that these types of experiences that you share with them will stay with them forever, more than something
Yeah,
that they read in a textbook.
absolutely. Absolutely.
So David's autopsy came back then after that period of time you got the fund,
Yep.
and he was
So we got the fund, and they were able to test David's blood, and it came back with the abnormalities of I'm not privy to the exact terminology, but the collagen gene or whatnot. It came back exactly what he thought. And so he was able to diagnose him with the VEDS, and I was tested. I do not carry the gene. So Dr. Marvin Miller pretty much has me, I'll say he has me 80% convinced that my kids are okay. I still get scared. I still worry about things. Now, my son is 23, actually 24. He'll be 25 this year. And he is very healthy, doesn't present any kind of symptoms, characteristics of any type of EDS for that matter. None. I'm very confident that he is good to go. Now, my daughter, I have a stepdaughter that is also 25 because I did say I had 3 kids. So I won't skip out on my stepdaughter, but she's not my genes. So she's good to go too. And then my other daughter she just turned 15. She has had quite the go round with the health issues. She has kind of been, I call her my sick kid. She's always had the typical, always something like the flu. She's always gotten every weird flu that you could possibly get. She had to have her tonsils and adenoids removed. She has recently, over the last couple years, she has began this cool fainting thing that she does. That's pretty not awesome. We don't really like that, but that kind of freaked me out when that started happening. That really kind of just, I don't know if you want to call it PTSD. And my brother never fainted or passed out, but he would get lightheaded very easily. Or I can remember the heat would kind of affect him differently than other people. He'd, just a little more frail, if you will, than others. And she is very much that way. And so when she started to pass out like that, that really freaked me out. And then last year, she started to have her kneecap dislocate. And she actually had to have a full reconstruction of her MCL last year because of that. So little things like that kind of freaked me out. And I have had her seen. Unfortunately, Dr. Marvin Miller can't see her, but I have had her seen by other professionals in that same hospital and office. And they are pretty convinced that she does not have any type of Ehlers-Danlos. Like I said, we'll see as she gets older how things progress. I hope that she does not, obviously. Yeah. I don't want her to have to, deal with those things. But if she does, I feel like now we are educated more and know better a little bit to just be a little more careful, maybe, or more proactive. It is kind of not funny, but just strange how it seems like just yesterday that we went through all of this. And I know it wasn't just yesterday. It's been a long time, but just the awareness that has come in this short amount of time. I mean, my 15-year-old daughter has a very good girlfriend that has EDS, not type 4, not VEDS, but she has the hypermobile type and she deals with a lot of stuff. And so to be able to relate to them and just let them know that they're not alone and we've been through that too and we're here for you. And when other people might think that you're crazy or not listening to you or don't want to understand why you might have to have an IEP that you can't go up and down the stairs all day at school. I get that. And so just to be somebody for those younger generation that, is dealing with those things too is a special thing for me.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So did your parents get tested for VEDS?
No. So my parents, as you can imagine, losing a child it's got to be the probably worst thing that you could go through. I can't really imagine anything worse than, having to watch your own child pass away before you do, or bury your own child, or any of those things. So a lot of guilt, I think, was carried, and they just decided that if I did not carry the gene, that they would not be tested. Maybe if I would have carried the gene, they would have, just to see kind of where it, came from. Because, I will say my mom is one of 9 kids and my dad is one of 5. And nobody in our family has had any kind of weird. I've had a cousin that passed away very young from leukemia, but nothing, genetic wise. And then I do have a second cousin that has Chiari. I believe is how you pronounce that syndrome. But other than that, we have a huge, huge, huge family, and there's been no other traumatic, early deaths like my brother's.
Yeah. And I'm so sorry for the loss of your brother. I think you were, like 28 at that time?
Yep, I was.
Yeah, I'm so sorry that you lost your brother to this. And
I appreciate that.
Yeah, I'm so grateful for you, like, continuing to advocate for people with VEDS and sharing his story and kind of not only keeping, his story alive that way, but the medical education that you've done and everything. I think it's so wonderful that
I'm very grateful for you for doing this and allowing people within the community to just share. And I just think it's so important to just keep sharing and not forget what, our loved ones and our families have gone through. And because it is just so traumatic. It's just such a traumatic thing. It's just a traumatic disorder. It's a traumatic, I'm not, discounting other disorders or anything, but it's just one of those like silent ones that, like my family, we had no idea. No idea.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
if you have something that you want medical professionals to know for other people who have VEDS, is there something you want them to know about it?
I think just my biggest thing is because VEDS is such a hard thing to like figure out. I feel like it's such a not talked about thing. Like if you are a medical professional and you are dealing with somebody that has these reoccurring things that are not adding up, like don't give up on them and refer them to a geneticist. Sometimes I feel like, gosh, that's all it would have taken for David to live a little bit longer with us, is if he just would have seen like the right doctor. And it's just like everyone, it was almost like they felt like he had seen everyone, but it was like, why not a geneticist? Why? Mm-hmm. Why not? Why wouldn't you refer that? I don't know what it takes to get that referral.
Yeah, but it's that jump from the hematologist to the
to the oncologist, to the you're going through all these ologists, but there's no geneticist that came into play. And it's just for me, I would rather it be symptoms and things like that send you to a geneticist rather than a death that is your referral.
Yeah, I feel like that's a really great message for medical professionals to hear. And so often, I think it's getting a little better, but I think so often I hear, people have their children go to the hematologist for the bruising or the oncologist. Like that is it's not an unfamiliar story. That like it stops there. They've ruled out leukemia, they've ruled out von Willebrand's and other like protein that
they did all of that on my daughter. Yep.
And then they're like, okay, well, it's fine. And there's a step after that still needs to happen.
Right.
And so much of your story too, I think, is of, what you've done after, where just a lot of advocacy. And I think that really shines in your story as well. Is that, something you would tell somebody who's just diagnosed with this or is trying to figure out what's wrong? They don't know.
Is what would I tell them?
Yeah, like what advice would you give somebody who's kind of struggling with this?
Oh gosh, my biggest advice would be your own advocate. Do your research and talk to other people that are going through this, because like I was telling you before, it's incredible, freaking incredible to me how many stories are incredibly similar. I forget who I was talking to the other day. It was someone asking me about why is zebra the symbol, and the best way that I can describe that is because like with VEDS, like it's very eerily similar. Like y'all have stripes, but like everybody has their own pattern of how things happen, because sometimes like some of the really traumatic stuff happens first, and then it slowly, and for David, it was a slow build up to the traumatic things. And then other stories I've heard, very, very traumatic things happening initially, so it's just crazy how many stories, and just being your own advocate. That for anybody that is diagnosed with this, that would be my biggest advice, because there's just not enough awareness within the medical profession. I just don't believe there's enough awareness, and you have to advocate for yourself.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on and
thank
sharing
you
David's
so
story.
much.
No, I really
appreciate you. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Is there any last thing that you want to say to the listeners?
Just thank you for listening, and keep sharing Katie's podcast. Keep sharing it. I will share it every chance I get. And, the only thing that we have is our voices, and I will always share his story until I can't anymore.
That's so sweet. Thank you so much, Mikala.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Staying Connected, featuring Mikala Tingley sharing her brother David's story with VEDS, or Vascular Ehlers-Danlos Syndrome. The next episode of this season on August 12th features Ben Weissman, who is coming on to share his story with Marfan syndrome.
So I am Benjamin Weissman. I live in Boot, New Jersey. I am 39 years old. I was born with Marfan syndrome. I'm the third generation in my family with Marfan. My grandfather had it. My mother, who's still alive and doing great up in Montreal, has it. And I'm here and with it. Professionally, I'm the director of development for Playwrights Horizons, which is an off-Broadway theater company in Hell's Kitchen in New York City. I'm also spending a lot of my time in politics. I'm an elected official. I'm a town council member here in the beautiful Boot, New Jersey. So this will be the first of potentially multiple plugs I will throw out there, but please come visit Boot, New Jersey. It's a wonderful place to visit. I live here with my dog, Kaya, my cat, Cleopatra, and most importantly, my wonderful wife, Lindsay.
Don't forget to subscribe to Staying Connected on your podcast player so you don't miss any future episodes. And if you like this show, I hope you will consider sharing it with your friends on social media to raise awareness of these conditions. You can also support the production of this podcast by joining my Patreon. Thanks so much, and I will see you soon.